The hospital air usually smells like floor wax and exhaustion, but that night, it smelled like ozone and impending rain. I was charting at the central station when the glass doors didn't just slide open. They seemed to explode inward as a group of men in tactical gear rushed in, carrying a man whose presence felt like a gravitational pull. The silence of the night shift shattered instantly. They weren't waiting for a triage nurse. They were a wall of muscle and urgency, moving with a synchronized military precision that screamed classified. In the center was him, a Navy SEAL, his uniform shredded and soaked in a deep dark crimson that looked black under the fluorescent lights. The lead medic, a man with eyes as cold as flint, didn't look at the attending physician. He looked straight at me and barked a single phrase that made the room turn ice cold. "She is the one on the manifest." I hadn't even stepped forward yet, but they knew exactly who I was, which sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my veins. As we rushed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, the chaos felt orchestrated, almost like a rehearsed play, where I was the only one who hadn't seen the script. Doctors were being blocked by a man in a dark suit who appeared out of nowhere, while I was pulled into the epicenter of the storm. The soldier, barely conscious, reached out with a hand that was trembling from shock and gripped my wrist with a strength that felt like a vice. He pulled me close, his breath smelling of copper and salt, and whispered a string of 6 numbers, followed by a name I hadn't heard since my childhood in the Midwest. It wasn't a medical request. It was a code. As I looked down to check his vitals, I saw it. A small silver coin pressed into his palm, etched with a symbol that matched a locket I had kept hidden in my locker for 10 years. My heart stopped. This wasn't just a patient. He was a bridge to a past I had tried to bury, and his arrival meant that the quiet life I built here was officially over. If this story has already gripped you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. I also want to know where you are watching from today. Let me know in the comments. My name is Elena Vance, and before the sirens and the secret codes defined my existence, I was just a girl from the suburbs of Chicago trying to make a difference in the medical field. I spent years working in high-pressure environments, but I moved to this quiet town in Virginia seeking peace, or so I thought. The man on the table was drifting in and out of consciousness, his grip on my wrist finally slackening as the sedative took hold. The doctors were frantic, but I was focused on that silver coin. It bore the insignia of a unit that officially did not exist. I felt the weight of the men in the hallway. The way they stood guard wasn't to protect the hospital. It was to contain the man inside this room. My pulse was drumming in my ears as I began to cut away his tactical vest. Underneath the Kevlar and the blood, I saw something that made my breath hitch. It wasn't just a wound. It was a surgical scar, perfectly horizontal, right over his heart, with a tiny, glowing blue light beneath the skin. This wasn't just a soldier. He was a prototype, a living experiment that had been brought to my emergency room because I was the only one who knew how to keep the secret. I remember my father used to talk about things like this in hushed tones when he thought I was asleep. He was a veteran who never quite left the battlefield behind, and seeing this soldier felt like looking at a ghost of my father's untold stories. The intrigue of this military presence in my mundane hospital ward was starting to draw a crowd of curious coworkers, but the men in suits quickly cleared the area. I felt a deep sense of responsibility wash over me. I wasn't just his nurse, I was his guardian. Every beep of the heart monitor felt like a ticking clock, counting down to a moment where I would have to choose between my career and the truth. The city of Richmond felt far away now, even though it was just a few miles down the road. Here, in this sterilized room, a different kind of war was beginning, and I was on the front lines. Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows that you feel the same way I did when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because what comes next changes everything. The atmosphere in the hospital shifted from medical urgency to high-stakes espionage within the hour. Men in dark suits, claiming to be from a department I had never heard of, began cordoning off the entire East Wing with an efficiency that was both impressive and terrifying. My supervisor, usually a woman of iron will who could stare down the toughest surgeons, looked pale and refused to meet my eyes when I passed her in the hall. I realized then that I wasn't just a nurse tonight. I was a witness to something they couldn't allow to leave these walls. I went to the break room to splash cold water on my face, trying to process the code the SEAL had whispered. It was my father's old service number, a man who had been declared missing in action 20 years ago in a jungle halfway across the world. The intrigue was thick enough to suffocate, and the gossip among the staff was already starting to spiral out of control. They whispered about a helicopter crash and a mission gone wrong, but I knew it was much deeper. I sat there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the stained mirror, thinking about my life here. I had moved to this town to escape the noise, to live a quiet life where the only drama was a difficult patient or a late shift. But now, the silence of my new life was being torn apart by a ghost from my past. As I walked back toward the trauma unit, I noticed one of the military guards watching me with a strange intensity. He didn't look like the others who stood like statues. He looked restless, his eyes darting toward the security cameras. He looked like he was waiting for me to make a move, or perhaps he was waiting for a chance to talk. When I passed him in the narrow corridor near the pharmacy, he bumped into me intentionally. In that split second of contact, he dropped a small, folded piece of paper into my scrub pocket without saying a single word, or even breaking his stride. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I felt the weight of that paper like it was made of lead. Now I want to know from you, where are you watching this story from? Write it down in the comments. It is incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. I locked myself in a supply closet, surrounded by the scent of sterile gauze and antiseptic, just to have a few seconds of privacy to read the note. It contained only 4 words written in a jagged, hurried hand. Trust no one here. The ink was still slightly fresh, and the message felt like a physical blow. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized the true scale of the danger I was in. Returning to the patient's side, I had to perform a standard dressing change, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the forceps. As I peeled back the blood-soaked bandages, I saw more than just the glowing light beneath his skin. Around his neck, tangled in the monitors and wires, was a dog tag, but the name on it wasn't his. It was mine, Elena Vance. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird in a cage. How could a man I had never met, an elite soldier from a shadow unit, be wearing a tag with my name? I began to realize that my entire life in this town, my job at this hospital, and even my sudden decision to move from Chicago might have all been orchestrated by forces I couldn't even name. I was no longer just a nurse providing care. I was a piece on a chessboard, and I didn't even know which side I was on. Just as I was about to tuck the tag back under his hospital gown to hide it from the cameras, the SEAL's eyes flew open. They weren't hazy from the medication anymore. They were clear, piercing, and full of a terrifying, sharp intelligence. He grabbed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm for a man in his condition and whispered, "They aren't here to save me, Elena. They are here to delete me. And now that you've seen the light, they'll delete you too." The gravity of his words hung in the air, heavier than the lead aprons we used in radiology. I looked at the security camera in the corner, wondering if they were listening to every word. Have you ever gone through something like this where you had to hide the truth or stay in silence to protect yourself? And the rest of the night was a blur of high-tension maneuvers and stifled whispers. Every time a doctor or a government agent entered the room, the SEAL would instantly feign unconsciousness, his breathing becoming shallow and regular, as if he were deep in a drug-induced sleep. But the moment we were alone, his demeanor shifted back to that of a predator on high alert. He began giving me rapid-fire instructions in a low, gravelly voice. He told me about a facility hidden deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains nearby, a place where soldiers were enhanced with experimental technology that the general public wouldn't see for another 50 years. He was a defector, a man who had seen the absolute darkness behind the curtain and decided to run before he lost his humanity entirely. The controversy of what he was telling me was staggering. If this information ever reached the public, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would topple governments and change the definition of what it means to be human. As I listened, I felt a strange and terrifying bond forming with him. It was a connection born of shared peril and the haunting ghost of my father's legacy. I started to notice things I had ignored before, the way the hospital lights seemed to flicker whenever he became agitated, and the way the electronic monitors would glitch if he touched them. The intruders in suits were becoming more aggressive by the minute, demanding his immediate transfer to a private facility under the guise of national security. I knew with a sinking certainty that if he left with them, he would never be seen again. He would become another missing person, just like my father. I had to make a choice that would define the rest of my life: follow the hospital protocol I had respected for 15 years, or become a fugitive to save a man who held the key to my own identity and my family's secrets. Adi, and the weight of the silver coin in my pocket felt like a burning coal against my thigh as I navigated the sterile, white corridors of the hospital. Every nurse I passed, every doctor who nodded a tired greeting, felt like a potential informant for the men in the dark suits. I started reflecting on my life back in Chicago, the long hours in the ER, the cold wind off Lake Michigan, and the feeling that I was always running from something I couldn't name. I moved here to Virginia to find a sanctuary, but as I looked at the armed guards stationed near the elevators, I realized that I had walked right into a trap that had been set 20 years ago. The city of Richmond, with its history and its secrets, was now the backdrop for a life-or-death struggle that felt more like a spy thriller than a medical shift. My professional life was built on the foundation of the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, but as I watched the general's men prepare a transport gurney, I knew that doing no harm might mean breaking every rule in the book. The conflict inside me was becoming physical. My stomach was in knots, and my breath was shallow as I entered the break room to gather my thoughts. I thought about the gossips in the cafeteria, the nurses who were already speculating about the secret soldier in room 4. They had no idea that the man they were gossiping about was the key to a global conspiracy. I remembered a specific moment from my childhood, a day when my father sat me down and told me that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is to remain silent when the world is screaming for answers. That memory solidified my resolve. I wasn't just Elena Vance, the quiet nurse from the suburbs anymore. I was a protector of a truth that could burn the world down. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the world is at its quietest and the most dangerous decisions are made. As the clock struck 3:15, the soldier, the SEAL, fully regained consciousness for a brief, lucid window of time. The glowing blue light beneath his skin seemed to pulse in synchronization with his heartbeat, casting a ghostly, ethereal hue against the hospital sheets. He looked at me, not as a patient looks at a nurse, but as a comrade looks at an ally. In a voice that sounded like grinding stones, he began to confess the truth about the mission that had brought him to my doorstep. It wasn't a standard operation. It was a retrieval mission that had gone horribly wrong. They had been sent to recover biological assets from a site that didn't exist on any map. He told me about the others who hadn't made it out. Men who were more machine than human now, stripped of their memories and their identities. The emotional toll of his words was devastating. I could see the grief in his eyes, a deep-seated sorrow for his brothers in arms who were lost to a project that treated soldiers like disposable hardware. The details he shared were almost impossible to believe, yet as I looked at the surgical scars and the dog tag with my name on it, I knew every word was the cold, hard truth. He explained that the code, he whispered, was part of a sequence my father had helped design before his disappearance. My father hadn't just been a soldier. He had been a lead scientist for the very program this man was trying to expose. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, making the room spin. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie built to protect me from this very moment. The SEAL grabbed my forearm, his eyes burning with urgency. Elena, they are coming for the data inside me. If they get it, your father's work becomes a weapon that can never be stopped. You have to help me get out of here before the sunrise. I could hear the heavy boots of the transport team echoing in the hallway, and I knew our time for talking was over. The tension reached a breaking point when the transport team, led by a man with a jagged scar across his chin, forced their way into the trauma room. They didn't have transfer papers. They had high-caliber weapons and an air of absolute authority that bypassed all hospital protocols. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, and blocked the path to the gurney. "This patient is not stable for transport," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through me. The man with the scar laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. He moved toward me, his hand resting on his holster, and told me that my medical opinion was no longer required. The controversy of the situation was unfolding in front of the entire night shift staff, who watched from the nursing station with wide, frightened eyes. I felt the weight of the silver coin in my pocket again, a reminder of the legacy I was now forced to carry. I looked at the SEAL, who remained perfectly still, his eyes closed as if he were dead, but I saw the slight tension in his jaw, the way his muscles were coiled like a spring. I knew he was waiting for my signal. I realized then that I was the one in control of the room, not the men with the guns. I had access to the hospital's internal systems, the power grid, and the emergency overrides. I made a split-second decision to create a diversion. I reached for the emergency alarm on the wall, but before I could pull it, the general walked in. He looked like he was carved out of granite, his presence alone enough to silence the room. He didn't look at the soldiers. He looked directly at me. "Nurse Vance," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are interfering with a matter of national security. Step aside or you will be treated as an enemy of the state." The choice was no longer about my job. It was about my survival. The general's threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. I looked at the SEAL, then back at the general, and I realized that if I stepped aside, I was complicit in the erasure of a human life. I chose a different path. Instead of stepping away, I leaned over the patient as if to check his dressing, and in one fluid motion, I deactivated the main power coupling for the entire wing, using the override code the soldier had whispered to me earlier. The hospital was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The backup generators, which usually kicked in within seconds, had been jammed by a bypass I had installed minutes before under the guise of maintenance. In those few seconds of chaos, the room became a theater of shadows. I felt the SEAL move. He was a blur of silent, lethal motion even in his weakened state. There was the sound of muffled blows, the clatter of weapons hitting the floor, and the panicked shouts of the transport team who were blind in the dark. I felt a hand grab mine in the blackness. It was warm and firm. "Go to the parking garage, level 3, the SEAL whispered near my ear. "The blue sedan. The keys are under the seat. Don't look back, Elena." Before I could respond, he was gone. When the emergency lights finally hummed back to life, flickering with a sickly yellow glow, the room was a wreck. The general was standing by the shattered window, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated unadulterated fury as he stared out into the rainy night. The bed was empty. The restraints had been cut with surgical precision. The general turned to me, his eyes narrowed to slits, and asked where he went. I stood there, covered in the dust of the scuffle, and felt a strange sense of peace. I looked him right in the eye, felt the silver coin heavy in my pocket, and told him with absolute conviction that I didn't see a thing. I was no longer a victim of the story. I was the one holding the pen. In the weeks that followed that harrowing night, the hospital returned to a haunting kind of normal, but I was a different woman. I resigned from my position, citing severe burnout and the need for a fresh start. But the truth was, I was waiting for a signal. I moved to a small, secluded cabin on the far outskirts of the state, living off the grid as much as possible, and keeping my eyes on the horizon. I spent my days wandering the woods, and my nights studying the old journals my father had left behind. Journals that finally made sense now that I had seen the light beneath the skin. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, a package arrived at my door with no return address and no postage marks. Inside was a single photograph of my father, looking young and vibrant, standing next to the very seal who had bled out in my trauma room. On the back, a single sentence was written in the same jagged hand. "The mission continues, and you are the key." I realized then that my life as a nurse in a quiet town was just the introductory chapter of a much larger, much more dangerous story. I am Elena Vance, and I am no longer hiding from the shadows of the past. I am searching for the truth that they tried to bleed out of a hero in Trauma Room 1, and I won't stop until the world knows what they are doing in those hidden facilities. The silver coin is now a necklace I wear every day, a constant reminder that some secrets are worth dying for, and some people are worth everything to save. I look out at the mountains every morning, knowing that somewhere out there, the soldier is waiting, and my father's legacy is finally within my reach. My life is intense, surprising, and full of nuances that I never could have imagined when I first put on my nursing scrubs. What do you think really happened to the seal and my father? Do you believe the truth is always worth the risk, even if it means losing everything you once knew? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters to this community of seekers. If you were moved by this journey, please subscribe to the canal and join our family. Every new member makes our voice stronger against the silence. Also, make sure to watch the next recommended video on your screen. The secrets only get deeper and more shocking from here.